Characters of the Reformation, Part 3. Anne Boleyn. Anne Boleyn is the pivot figure of the English Reformation. It was through her that the political and social phenomenon called Protestant England came into the world. She was not, of course, the cause of the movement, still less the cause of its final result. Innumerable causes converged towards that. But the movement would not have been launched, would not have been directed towards the goal which it ultimately reached, had not Anne Boleyn so completely dominated the King of England as to compel him ultimately to break with the unity of Christendom. And though Henry remained deeply attached to the Catholic doctrine and practice until his death, once he had broken with unity, that is, with the papacy, there was a breach in the dike and the flood was ready to pour through. Not only was Anne Boleyn not the cause of the great affair, but still less was she the inspirer of it. Least of all the actors, with the exception perhaps of Henry himself, was she filled with any conscious intention of effecting such a result. The personality to whom must be given that role of inspirer, the mind which planned the origins of that great change and made it likely to succeed through economic and as well as religious policy, was the mind of Thomas Cromwell. Anne, then, was neither the cause nor the inspirer of the first movement away from Catholicism. But she is what I have called her, the pivot figure. It is because she was what she was, and did what she did, that England is what England is today. It is, therefore, of the first importance to history to understand what this woman really was, and the real place of her action in the whole scheme of the time. From her day to our own it has been taken for granted that all national tradition, and by every historian, that she lay at the origins of the English Reformation. There has arisen an effort to weaken or question this sound tradition and to explain in other ways the quarrel between Henry and Rome, and the ultimate effect of it. This effort at supplanting true history by false is part of the general skepticism of our time, which is usually ready to accept anything new because new falsehoods sound more picturesque as a rule than well-worn truths. But there is here a more powerful motive, to make the origins of the change of religion in England look a little less ignoble than they really are. That is why Professor Pollard, for instance, who is the chief authority on the details of the period in England, tries to maintain the fantastic theory that Henry's attempt to get rid of his wife was not connected with Anne Boleyn, but with larger reasons of state, and that he had had the policy of getting rid of Catherine of Aragon in mind for many years before he met Anne Boleyn. The idea is not only fantastic, but desperate. It has no chance of being accepted out of England, and I do not think it will be accepted even in England, save by those who are very hard up for material in the whitewashing of Henry VIII's character. No, Anne remains and will remain at the origins of the catastrophe. It behooves us, therefore, to understand her and her effect as best we can. Anne Boleyn was a Howard. That is the first thing to grasp in connection with her, and it is all the more important to grasp it because historians have failed to stress as strongly as they should have stressed this capital feature in her position. She was a Howard through her mother, who was the daughter of that old Duke of Norfolk, the victor of Flodden, who was the sister of his son Thomas, 3rd Duke of Norfolk, who played a great part throughout the whole of Henry VIII's reign. The Howards were semi-royal. They had a somewhat different character from all the other great English nobles, although the family was not remarkably old, and the reason for this particular character of theirs was that they stood for a younger branch of the Plantagenet family, which was the true royal blood of England. The greatest of the Plantagenet kings, Edward I, one of the first figures of the height of the Middle Ages, the contemporary of St. Louis, and of Alphonse of Castile, and of St. Dominic, had a younger son, Thomas, generally called Thomas of Brotherton. He gave him vast estates, the title of Norfolk, and the hereditary post of Earl Marshal of England, that is, head of the English armed forces. The family of this Thomas soon ended in an heiress, who married a Mowbray, whereupon her husband took on the title of Earl Marshal, and all the tradition of the younger Plantagenet branch. The Mowbrays again soon ended in an heiress, who married a wealthy private gentleman of legal descent, but one already possessed of land in East Anglia. This private gentleman was called Howard, and his son took over the tradition of Thomas of Brotherton and of the Plantagenet younger line. He was hereditary Earl Marshal of England through his marriage, and he was made Duke of Norfolk, the title of Duke being at that time of quasi-royal significance, and only given to those who were of royal blood or represented a branch of it. In Anne Boleyn's time, the Howard marriage into the blood royal was already more than a century old. This Howard, who thus became Duke of Norfolk, only acquired his title 30 years before Henry VIII came to the throne, and, though they were not, under the name of Howard and through the male line, of any great importance, they were very important as representing the continued tradition of the Earl Marshalship and the younger Plantagenet blood, and as having a dukedom with its connotation of connection with the crown. This first Duke of Norfolk had fought against Henry VIII's father, and his title had been taken away from him, but it was restored to his son, the one who was victor at Flodden, as I have said, who was called the second Duke of Norfolk, and it was inherited by his son, again Thomas, 3rd Duke of Norfolk, the uncle of Anne Boleyn. So Anne Boleyn comes to the court of Henry VIII under the introduction and auspices of the Howard connection. Her father, Sir Thomas Boleyn, was a very wealthy man, nothing like the equal of his wife socially, but of considerable family importance through his mother, of the Irish family of Ormond. On his father's side he was descended from big merchants in the city of London. He had considerable talent, especially as a diplomatist, and was used by the government on many occasions. Now that we have understood who Anne Boleyn was in the high society of England at the time, the next thing to understand is her age, appearance, and character. Oddly enough, considering what a great position she held even before captivating Henry, we are not quite certain of the date of her birth. It would take up too much time to marshal all the arguments here which have been advanced for various dates, the one most generally given, 1507, is almost certainly wrong. I myself incline to 1502 or 1503. At any rate, it was earlier rather than later. The point is of importance, because her age had a good deal to do with our understanding of the way in which she intrigued and of her capacity for fulfilling her ambition. If she were born in 1507, she would be only 18 when Henry began to understand that he could not have her unless he married her. And she would only be 14 when she is first talked of as mixed up in an affair. That is why 1507 seems to me an impossible date, for men were already claiming to be her lovers as early as 1521. On the other hand, if she were 18 in 1521, and over 20 when she began to make it clear to Henry that he must marry her, and that she would not be his mistress, the whole state of affairs became inexplicable. Anyhow, we may take it, round the year 1525, this young woman was something between 20 and 23 years of age, and had thoroughly captured the king. She was about the court both as the daughter of her important official father, and as an attendant upon Queen Catherine, but also in another connection, which it is important though unpleasant to recollect, because it helps to explain Henry's action. Her younger sister Mary had already been the mistress of Henry VIII in a very early youth, and he had got rid of her by marrying her off to one of his gentlemen. She is usually called the older sister, but this is a mistake. Anne's appearance was singular. She carried herself rather badly, was flat-chested and round-shouldered. She had a very thick neck, with the Adam's apple prominent and large, to which it was thought she owed her really fine contralto voice. She also had very long, glossy hair, and powerful black eyes. Beautiful in an ordinary sense of the word she certainly was not, but she had a strange and not healthy power of fascination, at least over certain types of men. She was slightly deformed. The little finger of one hand was double. Those who would flatter her called her two nails. People on the other tack roundly said that she had two little fingers. It was a defect which she was always at pains to conceal as best she could. She used her fascination calculatedly and coldly, and used it so from an early age. When she may have been anything between her 16th and her 18th year, more probably about 18, in the year 1521 she so caught and entangled the heir of the greatest non-royal family in England, the Percys of Northumberland, that he was hopelessly in her power. She remained till his death full of that memory, long after he had given her up. For when she found she had a chance of higher game, she got rid of him at once. Meanwhile she had a second string to her bow, even at that early period, in another conquest of hers, Wyatt, a gentleman closely connected with Henry, not a pleasant character, and one who later, I think, traduced her, pretending that she had been his mistress, as quite a young girl. I do not think this is true, because of what we know of Wyatt's character and what we know of her own, which was frigid and determined to make the most of every opportunity. There was nothing impulsive about her. She would not have ruined her chances by yielding to a man in Wyatt's position. It was probably as early as this time, 1521, that the king, whom then was a man of 30, began to consider her. He probably also had about that time, and certainly immediately afterwards, given up living with his legitimate wife, Catherine, although there was no outward semblance of any breach between them. He had already had other adventures, and that illegitimate son born to him by Elizabeth Blount, a lady who had been an old playmate of his in early youth, and we've seen how he had taken Anne's sister Mary for a mistress and discarded her. I have said that this point should especially be borne in mind, because it helps to explain the way in which Anne, who seems to have had much more willpower than her sister, attracted him. He was evidently drawn to the family type. We must presume, of course, that Henry at this early stage did not intend marriage. He sent sharp orders that the engagement with young Percy should be put to an end, and used Wolsey as his agent in doing so. Some think, however, that he was thus acting as early as 1521, rather with the idea of making a marriage for Anne as heiress of the Ormonds, and thus using her politically. Whether this were so or no, at any rate, soon he intended to make her his mistress. We have no documents. We can only judge by the nature of the case and by what followed, but it is fairly clear that some time before, or in the very early part of 1525, when Henry was 34 years of age and Anne was well over 20, perhaps as much as 23, there was some arrangement between them, and that Anne had already given Henry to understand that she would not be his mistress, but would envisage marriage if he could get rid of Catherine. In that year her father was raised to the peerage, and given a new and more prominent position, and in that year we have also large gifts from Henry to Anne, and Henry's interfering with her movements and saying where she is to stop. It does not follow that Henry had thus early accepted the idea of marrying Anne. He probably still thought she would become his mistress at last. To attempt to repudiate Catherine, the niece of the Emperor of Germany and the King of Spain, the most prominent woman in the greatest family in Europe, would be a very serious business indeed, and Henry's hesitating and uncertain character would certainly come to a decision at once in the matter. In the summer of 1526 he had taken the first steps towards getting the marriage with Catherine annulled, upon the plea that the original dispensation for marrying his deceased brother's wife was invalid. In 1527 he took open steps in this direction, and for the divorce, as it was called, though of course it was an effort at annulment and not at divorce, in the modern sense of the term, for in those days when everyone was Catholic, divorce in the modern sense was not conceivable. And thenceforward, for 5 years, Anne tyrannized over him more and more, till the unfortunate man was hardly sane in regard to her. She could do what she willed with him, and drove him at her discretion to the most impossible public actions. In order to get her, he began that worrying of the Pope which ended at last in the complete breach with Rome. What exactly the relations were between them during this interval we can guess rather than prove, though even our guess must be of tentative character, as it is also of a displeasing one. Displeasing though it may be, It is necessary to have some precision in the matter, because unless we appreciate the relations of these two, we shall not understand the complete subjection into which Henry fell. She would not allow him complete satisfaction until she was virtually certain, every obstacle having been removed by the death of the old, very Catholic and saintly Archbishop Warham, that even if the papal court did not grant annulment, Henry would take the matter into his own hands and marry her. She thus began to live with Henry as though she were already married to him, somewhere between September or October of the year 1532. Before Christmas of that year she was with child. Her chaplain, Cranmer, had been marked down for the Archbishopric of Canterbury. He was enthroned in the March of 1533, pronounced the marriage between Henry and Catherine null and void, proclaimed Anne to be the legitimate wife of Henry immediately after, and crowned her queen in Westminster a few days after the sentence. Her child, who grew up to be Queen Elizabeth, was born in the September of that year. Now began the process which may be observed in parallel cases, in all times and places, including our own day. It was a case such as many of us have come across in our own observation. Henry, having been driven pretty well off his head by this woman's pertinacious handling of him, and refusal for so many years to surrender herself completely to him, was, now that he obtained satisfaction, changed in her regard. She had a bitter tongue, not without wit, using the French language, in which she was trained and in which she thought as well spoke. She ridiculed Henry behind his back, and he got to hear of it. Her fine voice and singing had ceased to attract him. Perhaps it also deteriorated. She had accumulated enemies by her violent fits of temper, which she had never restrained in her angers with Henry himself. So it was not only the weariness of Henry with her, but also active irritation against her, which began to change her fortunes. He was tired of her. He began to dislike her. Soon he hated her. And if they still carried on, it was only because Henry hoped she would give him an heir, a boy. She probably would have done so, but for his brutality. For a miscarriage which she suffered early in 1536 was by herself ascribed to his infidelity and roughness to her. She said that she had been so pulled down by the whole business that her health had suffered, and we must remember in this connection that Henry himself had long been suffering from venereal disease. At any rate, a miscarriage she had, and what with his disappointment and his increasing loathing, Henry was determined to be rid of her. His character had deteriorated rapidly. Moreover, he was superstitious, and seemed to have gotten it into his head that she had bewitched him. An indictment was framed against her, the validity of which I will discuss in a moment. She was accused of adultery with various people, including a couple of gentlemen about the court, one of the royal musicians, of lower birth, and even with her own brother. Thomas Cromwell, then all-powerful, master of things spiritual and temporal in England, as the king's vice-regent over his new schismatic church, and the king's lieutenant in civil affairs, was as determined as Henry upon her death, for it would get rid of a rival. Henry had already determined who should succeed her, a certain Jane Seymour, daughter of a small landed gentleman in Wiltshire, whose sons were employed at court, while Jane herself was, had been, about the court as a maid of honor. Henry and Cromwell used Cranmer to ruin Anne by frightening and threatening her after a pretended friendship, and Cranmer's action was the more base considering that his whole advancement and position were solely due to his having been a creature of the Boleyns and their chaplain. The wretched woman fell into an hysterical condition at the approach of death. She was left uncertain whether she would be burned or decapitated. On Friday, May 19th, 1536, she was beheaded with a sword within the precincts of the Tower of London by the headsman from Calais, brought over especially for the execution. Was she guilty of the misconduct ascribed to her? It is one of the most fiercely debated points in English history. Standing as she does at the origins of the Reformation, the favorers of that movement have been hot in her defense. On the other hand, those who desire to exculpate Henry as much as they can exculpate that detestable character like to believe her guilty, while for the defenders of the old religion nothing was too bad to be put down to Anne. The accusations, especially that of incest, seemed so monstrous that their very enormity is an argument in her favor. On the other hand, she was certainly unscrupulous in affairs of this kind, and she seems to have been quite unbalanced in the last year or two of her life. Some who have had medical experience in these matters maintain she suffered from a particular irresponsibility, which make the charges credible enough. I have myself always inclined to accept them, but many good students of the period with whom I have discussed the matter are divided, and some urge the strong argument that the two gentlemen concerned did not confess, while the musician who did confessed only under threat of torture. Anyhow, they were all put to death as well as herself. Catherine had died before her. Henry's marriage with Jane Seymour took place immediately after Anne's death, was therefore quite legitimate in the eyes of the Church, and quite probably there would have been a reconciliation with Rome had it not been for Thomas Cromwell already launched the policy of confiscating church property, beginning with the monasteries, a policy which created a vested interest of great power against reunion. Anne's fatal attraction, therefore, had come just sufficiently late to start the ball of the Reformation rolling. She had not intended it. She had intended only to fulfill a petty and personal policy, in which she triumphed only to bring about her own destruction. But she will remain forever, in spite of lack of intention, the origin of that long movement which ended by the complete change of the English mind and character, and supplanting, after a troubled and heavily contested struggle lasting over 150 years, of the old Catholic England by the new and modern Protestant one. Thomas Cromwell. Thomas Cromwell is one of those figures in history, not numerous, of which we may say that they are never presented in their full stature. He was, in his own line, a genius of the first order, and fortune allowed him to play a part of the first magnitude. He is the true creator of the English Reformation, and therefore of the general catastrophe which overwhelmed the secure and ancient civilization of Christendom. Yet for a dozen men who could tell you a fair amount about his master, Henry VIII, or about any other of the prominent figures of the time, there is barely one who could give you much more than the name of Thomas Cromwell. Or, perhaps, add to it the fact that it was he who undertook the destruction of the English monasteries. What is still stranger, most people do not connect him with the other famous Cromwell, Oliver, though Oliver was his great-nephew. But there is a reason for that. It has always paid the official historians in England, and pretty well all English history of the modern sort is official and anti-Catholic, to pretend that Oliver Cromwell was a bluff, middle-class person, truly representative of the English people, and to conceal the fact that he was the cadet of an immensely wealthy family, one of the wealthiest in England, whose huge fortunes came entirely from the loot of the church. What adds to one's estimate of Thomas Cromwell's intellectual stature, and one's corresponding detestation of the harm he proved capable of doing, is the fact that he was the sole architect of his own fortunes. Alone of the principal Reformation characters, he started from nothing. No birth, no money, no classical or clerical education, no friends, nothing. He was the son of a petty beerhouse keeper in Putney. He had grown famous and powerful. Stories about him grew up, of course, as they always will about such people. But when you look into them, you'll find that the only certain fact is that I have just stated, his coming from this beer shop on the south bank of the Thames, a little above London. He went off as a vagabond in early youth, and the very little we know of him seems to show that he took what was then the best chance for an adventurous tramp, military service. He seems to have hired himself out to someone of these captains who went about gathering fighters for hire and then striking a bargain with the various princes and powers at war. For in those days there were no standing armies and no conscription. And when governments wanted to fight, they had to raise what men they could hurriedly and at a fairly high price. The best field for this kind of thing was Italy, and thither young Cromwell drifted. Perhaps he got some loot out of the fighting, but also pretty certainly picked up some Italian, for he read Machiavelli and in later life would quote his maxims. With whatever little capital he had got together in his dangerous trade, he appears in the house of some big Italian moneylenders of the day. Later on he returned to England and started his own as a moneylender, on quite a large scale. But Thomas Cromwell was much more than a moneylender, even in those first years of his advancing manhood. He had got hold of a good deal of law, and he had a fine grasp of details in all business, remarkable industry, lucidity of judgment, and rapidity of action. It was these which recommended him to the notice of the great Wolsey. He may have been recommended by one of the many fairly important people to whom he had lent money, and whose bonds he held, for the money-lender can always get recommendations at the expense of relieving his debtor and a little from pressure. Anyhow, he appears as a sort of manager for Wolsey in important affairs, and so gets richer and richer. Unfortunately for Cromwell's soul, and for the Catholic Church in England, and indeed throughout Christendom, he happened to come into Wolsey's employ just at the moment when the great cardinal was planning his new and splendid college at Oxford, which was to be something much bigger than the university had yet known. In order to found this college, Wolsey had got the papal authority to suppress a certain number of small, decayed monasteries, draft the monks into the larger houses of their orders, and use their revenues for this great new establishment of his, which would, of course, be of a clerical character. In visiting the smaller monasteries, whose wealth was thus transferred to another kind of clerical use, Wolsey employed Thomas Cromwell. And it was in these visitations that Cromwell learned all the technique of visitation and inquiry and inventory, and all the rest of it. When Wolsey fell, after Henry's failure to obtain a divorce from Rome, Thomas Cromwell played a very clever game. He boldly sought an interview with the king, the details of which are, of course, hidden, but the results of which are clear, and of which Henry's cousin Cardinal Pole has told us the essentials. He seems to have urged upon the king the policy of threatening the Pope with schism unless the divorce were ultimately granted, and perhaps at this same time he made the first suggestion of looting the church. But, though he went over to the secret service of the king, he was not publicly admitted to be a royal servant till nearly 3 years later. He was not so foolish as to throw over Wolsey, his late master. In the first place, he knew very well that nothing would make him look more odious than ingratitude. In the next place, there was nothing to be gained by spurning the great man who had made his career. And in the third place, what I think decided him, he knew that Henry in his heart regretted the loss of Wolsey. The king had been compelled by Anne Boleyn to get rid of Wolsey, but he would send, semi-privately, messages to the fallen minister, and felt a continued real friendship for him. So it would never have paid Thomas Cromwell to have given Henry the impression that he, Cromwell, was Wolsey's enemy. However, Wolsey died soon after, and therefore that part of the problem was solved. Cromwell continued through successive years of the divorce movement, that is, 1531, 1532, and 1533, to frame and urge the governmental policy and to increase the pressure on the Pope. He was, for instance, the author of that special piece of policy called the Annates Bill. The Annates were the first year's revenue of any bishop's see in England, which was paid over to the papal court as a tax. A new bishop, on being appointed to a see, paid over the first year's revenue in this fashion to Rome. Cromwell had a law made saying that the annates were to be henceforth payable not to Rome, but to the king's treasury, but adding that whether this law should come into effect or not depended on the king's good will. The object was, of course, to put an increasing strain upon papal policy. If the annates had been confiscated, the papal treasury would have had no cause to bargain, but with the threat of confiscation hanging over the Pope's head, it was hoped that he would prove amenable to Anne Boleyn's desire, and pronounce Henry's marriage with Catherine null and void. In the same way it was Thomas Cromwell who pushed through the final steps of the schism, ending with the decisive act of November 1534, when Henry was declared head in all things, spiritual and temporal, of the realm of England, with power to judge in all spiritual cases and to define doctrine and the rest of it. Cromwell made of his master Henry a local lay pope. And how true this is you can see from the fact that Henry insisted on papal titles being given to himself. He called himself the Vicar of Christ on earth, so far as the realm of England was concerned, and had formulas used to him which were the same as those hitherto used to the Pope by those who addressed him official letters. Thomas Cromwell, by the time all this was accomplished, that is, by the time Cranmer had pronounced the divorce between Henry and Catherine of Aragon, by the time Henry had married Anne Boleyn, by the time of Anne Boleyn's child, Elizabeth, had been born and declared heir to the throne, was completely master of England and wholly controlled and managed Henry himself. Cromwell was not only the lay head of the country, a despotic minister with absolute power doing what he willed, but he was also the spiritual head, for Henry delegated to him all his own spiritual power. And Cromwell exercised that spiritual power very thoroughly indeed. He made the bishops understand that they were nobodies compared with himself. He sent his officials throughout their dioceses, adjudicating and settling and punishing and the rest, as though he were a universal bishop whose power superseded that of all others. Yet all the time Cromwell was only a layman. Within a year of Cromwell's having worked the schism with Rome, that is, in 1535, he began two things side by side. One was a reign of terror, which was inaugurated by the arrest and at last the execution of a very highly placed people, laymen and clerics, who withstood the schism. The other was the dissolution of the monasteries. It is with this last activity that Cromwell's name will always be chiefly associated. He was the direct author of the great orgy of loot, which followed thenceforward for the better part of a lifetime, and his motive in his move was personal gain. The whole of his life had been devoted to acquiring wealth, usually by the basest means, and that sufficiently accounts for all that he did in the matter of the religious houses. He began by suppressing the smaller houses, that is, those whose incomes were less than what we should call today about £5,000 a year. These smaller houses accounted for barely a quarter of the monastic wealth of England. The whole thing was arranged after a fashion which testified highly to Cromwell's ability, for it was so worked that things should lead on from one step to another until all the monastic and conventual life in England was destroyed. The first step was merely to take an inventory and to begin an examination into the alleged irregularities of certain houses. The next was to declare a policy of confiscation for the smaller houses, on the plea that they were generally badly managed and often corrupt. But while this was going on, there was no hint of attack on monasticism as a religious principle, or on the monastic wealth as a whole. The heads of the great houses acquiesced in the movement. Monks and nuns from the smaller houses were drafted into the larger houses, and Cromwell gave it to be understood that the money taken from the suppressed small houses would be used for pious purposes. Then came the last step. No law was made compelling the surrender of the great houses, like the law that had been made to compel the surrender of the smaller ones. Some were seized on the plea that they had been treasonable. In others the abbot was heavily bribed to surrender his house peacefully to the king. In others some charge of theft or other crime was trumped up against the ruling head of the establishment, till altogether, in one way or another, every single one of the monastic houses of England was surrendered to the king and ceased to exist. The wealth did not stay in the king's hands, of course. Cromwell himself made a very large fortune out of the pickings. He gave no less than 13 monastic estates to his nephew, of whom more in a moment, and he gave land as benefactions right and left, as also did the king. Later, on much of the abbey lands thus confiscated were given away to favorites of the court, or, what was very common, were sold at half the price or less. It is one of the commonest things for such of the so-called Reformation families as remain, that is, the English families whose wealth is founded on the loot of the church in the 16th century, to boast that they paid for their land honestly. But when you look into the details, you continually find that they got it for an average of 10 years' rent, a sum which was about half the market prices of the estates. Cromwell's motive in this gigantic economic revolution, which made about 1/5 of the upper-class surplus incomes of England change hands, was merely loot. But the ultimate effect, which he did not directly intend, was to create a strong vested interest against reconciliation with Rome. The looted land was sold and resold. As time passed, families which had not been enriched married into those which had, and at last pretty well every landed family in England had been, as it were, bribed not to admit England's being made Catholic again. Even when Mary Tudor, long after Cromwell's death, proposed reconciliation with the papacy, the English upper classes refused to consider the idea unless the Pope would solemnly promise that they could keep the stolen lands, which the Pope reluctantly did. Even so, it was their possession of the abbey lands which determined all the position of the English gentry for a lifetime, and made them determined to prevent the return of the Mass to England. And as an example of one of these families, let me return to Thomas Cromwell's own nephew, of whom I spoke. Cromwell's sister married a young man, the son of another alehouse keeper in Putney, called William ap Williams. She had a son, Henry, whom Thomas Cromwell took up and advanced, making him, before he died, entirely out of church loot, one of the wealthiest men in England. The nephew dropped the name of Williams for the name of Cromwell, established his son as a great magnate, and, with his principal seat built out of the ruins of a stolen nunnery at Hitchingbroke, and that son's grandson was the Oliver Cromwell of the next century. Thomas Cromwell thus ruled England, becoming one of the richest men of the country in the process, right on till 1540. His power was, of course, very offensive to the old nobles, and even the new upstarts were jealous of him. But he feared nothing from them so long as he could manage the king. What broke down his hold over the king was a ludicrously simple incident. He overestimated his power and tried to make Henry, who had long ago put Anne Boleyn to death, and whose succeeding wife, Jane Seymour, had died, marry into one of the lesser German Protestant princes' families, that of the Duke of Cleves, on the Lower Rhine. Cromwell's foreign policy was not Protestant in any religious sense. He was during all his active life indifferent to religion altogether, but it paid him to tie Henry up with the Protestant princes of Germany, if he could, so that there would be no going back upon the schism, and so that also his own vast fortune, built out of confiscated church lands, could be secure. When Anne of Cleves came over to be married, Henry was disgusted with her. Always impulsive and weak as he was, he fell into a furious temper with Cromwell for having let him in for such a botheration, as this unsuitable marriage. Meanwhile, the Howards, the head of the older nobility and close connections by marriage of Henry's, were working ceaselessly against Cromwell's power, as was Henry's brother-in-law, Seymour, the uncle of the little boy who would be the king's heir. What with Henry's raging bad temper at having been bamboozled into the Anne of Cleves marriage, what with his irritation in feeling that Cromwell acted as though he were supreme in the state, and what with the Howards, and the Seymours pushing the king on, the determination was taken to get rid of Cromwell at last, and in the early summer of 1540, when he was a man of well over 50 and at the height of his power and wealth, he was suddenly arrested at the council board. He was condemned to death by attainder, without trial, and made the few days between the condemnation and his death both pitiable and memorable by the imploring letters which he wrote to the king, begging and even screaming for life. He ended one of them with the famous cry, "Mercy, mercy, mercy." He fawned and cringed, using the most extraordinary phrases, comparing Henry to God, and saying that the perfume of the royal hand would waft him to heaven if he were allowed to kiss it again. But it was all in vain. He was to die, and die he did on July 28th, 1540. There on the scaffold a strange thing happened. Cromwell had the reputation of being perfectly indifferent to religion, an atheist concerned only with this world, and therefore utterly without scruple. He had supported the anti-Catholic movement with all his might because it made his loot secure. Now that he was about to die, he declared himself, to the astonishment of everybody, a firm adherent of the national and traditional faith. His sincerity had been doubted, but without sufficient grounds. I think the matter is clear enough. He had been horribly afraid of death all his life, a trait, by the way, which you would also find in his great-nephew, Oliver. He, therefore, would never contemplate death, and therefore also put religion out of his mind. But when he was face to face with death and had to deal with it somehow, he admitted Catholic truth and confessed his acceptance of it. The phenomenon is not uncommon and quite explicable by all that we know of the human mind. Whether this last repentance saved him or not, we cannot tell. But his work was accomplished before his head fell. He had effected the breach with Rome, and by his loot of the church he had made possible all the further steps by which England was transformed to a Protestant from a Catholic country, at the same time giving the whole governing class of England a strong financial motive for never allowing the mass to return to England if they could help it. That class, which still has much of its old power, remains to this day the chief enemy of the Catholic Church.